Family Dinner is a short spooky story about a young boy who spends most of his time alone, playing by himself. When he realizes he is late for dinner, he rushes home, but his journey takes him down a dark and creepy alley. Little Lucas was only 7 years old, but he had a very active imagination. He was a skinny child with pale skin and dark circles under his eyes. Having no other boys his age to play with, he spent most of his time alone. It was dark and Lucas was playing alone by the canal. It was a place he loved to go, because there was no one there to disturb him. He imagined he was a knight in shining armor saving damsels in distress from being eaten by an evil dragon. The stick in his hand was a huge sword, and he cut the dragon in two before it could sink its teeth into the screaming girl. Coming back to reality, Lucas realized that he had lingered too long by the canal and he was late for dinner. He cringed as he imagined his mother scolding him. Picking up his pace, he hurried towards home. Like many children his age, Lucas never wanted to admit he was scared of anything. However, in the darkness, the road home looked strange and unfamiliar. He lived near a cemetery, but that was not what scared him. Ever since he was a baby, his parents had taught him that he had nothing to fear from the dead. To reach home, he had to walk down a long, deserted alley that was bordered on both sides by abandoned buildings and disused factories. As he walked past the dirty and broken windows, he imagined eyes staring at him from the darkness and grotesque beasts lying in wait behind every corner. He could not admit to himself that he was afraid. His father always said that fear was for cowards, and Lucas didn't want to see himself as a coward. After all, he was a knight, a brave warrior, and he shouldn't be afraid of anything. That night, the alley was much more quiet than usual, and Lucas had to tell himself to be brave. He could hear his footsteps echoing distinctly all the way, and every so often he thought he saw strange movements in the windows of the dilapidated buildings. "Come on, Lucas," he mumbled. "You have nothing to fear." Just then, he heard a loud noise up ahead and a trash can tumbled over. It startled him and he stopped suddenly in his tracks, shaking like a leaf. Then, he saw a big rat skitter across the alley and disappear into one of the abandoned buildings. Lucas breathed a sigh of relief and kept on walking. Minutes later, he heard the sound of footsteps echoing behind him. The blood froze in his veins. He turned around just in time to see the dark shadowy figure approaching in the distance. All he could make out was the silhouette of a tall man in the moonlight. Lucas was overcome by a feeling of impending doom, and panic gripped his heart. He wanted to run, but for a moment, the muscles in his refused to comply. He was rooted to the spot. Glancing behind him again, he realized that the shadowy man was getting closer and closer. His heart beating fast, Lucas took off running like a madman. The dark figure was hot on his tail. He was only a short distance from his home, but he was being pursued. The frightened boy ran as fast as he desperately trying to reach the safety of his house. He could hear the footsteps behind him getting nearer and nearer. All of a sudden, he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He spun around, eyes wide with terror, and came face to face with the tall man. "Lucas, where have you been?" he said. It was the voice of his father. A wave of relief washed over the little boy and his knees stopped shaking. He was safe at last. "Your mother's been worried sick," his father sighed, shaking his head. "I forgot what time it was," mumbled Lucas. His father took him by the hand and led him home. When they walked into the kitchen, his mother got up from the table. She had a frown on her face. "What time do you call this?" she scolded. "You're late for dinner, young man." "Sorry, Mom," Lucas replied, hanging his head. "It won't happen again." "Well, what are you waiting for?" she said. "Set the table while your father gets dinner ready." Lucas ran over to the kitchen drawer, took out the knives and forks and placed them on the table. His father went down into the basement, and when he returned, he was carrying a young girl. Her hands were tied behind her back and there was a gag over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror. His father carried the girl over to the kitchen table and placed her in the center, on a silver platter. "Dinner is served," he announced. Together, the family of ghouls devoured the young girl, tearing into her flesh, munching on her organs and gobbling her intestines until there was nothing left but a pile of bloody bones. Don't Google yourself. Why? Because you may not like what you find. One day, I was bored and decided to search for my own name on Google. I have quite a rare name, so I didn't expect to find many results. Imagine how surprised I was when I came across a website that had my full name in the domain. When I clicked the link, it brought me to a message board. I looked at the profile of the website owner and found out that the person was the same age as me and had the same hobbies and interests. There weren't any posts on the message board, but I was intrigued, so I saved it in my favorites. It was about a month later when I went back to the website. This time, it had more content. There were some diary entries, mostly random things like the weather was nice today or I'm so bored in work. Things of that nature. However, as time went on, I began to notice more and more coincidences. The person lived in the same city as I did. It struck me as rather strange that two people with the exact same rare name would be living in the same city at the same time. At one point, I noticed that the contents of the diary were quite similar to my own life. One day, I went to a baseball game and when I checked the website that evening, I found that the owner of the site had gone to the same ball game. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, tens of thousands of people in the city supported the same baseball team. It began to seem like much more than a simple coincidence. Whenever I checked the website, I would notice little biographical details that seemed too close for comfort. For example, the owner mentioned their pet dog and the dog's name was the same as the dog I had when I was a child. The website owner posted a picture of their car. It was the same model of car I had been driving when I was in college. They talked about eating at a certain restaurant. It was the same restaurant I had gone to all the time when I was working at my previous job. One day, when I looked at the message board, people had written messages to the owner saying happy birthday. That day, it was my birthday as well. I decided to write on the message board for the first time, just out of curiosity. I was going to wish the owner a happy birthday and tell them we had the same name. However, when I tried to write something, I realized that there was nowhere to type your message. It wasn't a message board at all, just a static page. That's odd, I thought to myself. In other words, whoever owned the website had gone to a lot of trouble to make it seem as if it was an interactive site, as if there were other people posting on it, when in actual fact, all the content must have been created by the owner. Why on earth would someone do that? I wondered. I decided to send an email to the owner. It read, "Hi there. Believe it or not, we both share the same name. Nice to meet you." It was just a friendly email. The next day, when I tried to look at the website, I discovered that it was gone. It seemed like it had been deleted. Then, I opened my mailbox. There was one reply. When I looked at it, a chill ran down my spine. It just read, "Found you." Stop Eating is a scary story about an old woman whose grandson stuffs his face with food. There was a young boy named Peter who lived with his mother in a run-down apartment building. His father had deserted the family shortly after he was born. His mother was a drug addict and she didn't take care of Peter properly. The young boy often had to root around in rubbish bins to find something to eat. One day, Peter came home to find his mother lying on the kitchen floor. She had died of a drug overdose. Nobody knew how to contact the boy's father, so he was sent to live with his grandmother. Peter's grandmother loved him very much, but she was a poor woman and could barely afford to feed herself. She had a small kiosk near the train station where she sold cigarettes to passers-by and earned a meager living. Whenever she had some money, she would buy groceries and stock the fridge, but before she knew it, Peter would eat everything in sight. Peter was like a starving animal. He couldn't stop eating and stuffed his face with food until his cheeks looked like they were about to burst. It drove his grandmother to distraction. "Peter," she would shout. "You must stop eating. If you keep this up, you're going to eat us out of house and home." But Peter couldn't stop. Every day, while his grandmother was at work, he would clean out the fridge, then go hunting through the kitchen cupboards, searching for leftover food. "Peter," cried the grandmother, "I am a poor woman. If you don't stop this, we will both starve to death." When Peter still didn't listen to her warnings, the frustrated woman began to beat him. She didn't want to hurt the boy, but she had to stop his binge eating. She was 3 months behind in the rent and there wasn't a morsel of food in the apartment. Peter became afraid of his grandmother and dreaded the beatings every time she came home. He began making plans to run away from home. One day, Peter disappeared. His grandmother went around to all the neighbors, asking if they had seen him. She searched the neighborhood, knocking on doors and peeking in windows, but she couldn't find him anywhere. Eventually, she went down to the police station and filed a missing persons report, but the police could not find the boy either. A month passed, and suddenly, Peter returned. One morning, the grandmother heard a faint knock on the door of her apartment. She opened the door and saw her grandson standing there. His face was pale, his cheeks were sunken and his clothes were ragged. The old woman embraced him and hugged him tightly. All Peter said to her was, "Grandma, I want to eat." The grandmother immediately opened the fridge and pulled out everything that was there: soup, salad, sausage. As the old woman boiled the soup, her grandson sat down at the table and began to eat. Peter stuffed his face with food, cramming it into his mouth until his cheeks were swollen. His grandmother was so glad to have him back, she didn't say anything. Just then, the old woman noticed something strange. Every time Peter opened his mouth, something fell out. She looked down at the table and saw a bunch of wriggling maggots. The old woman stared at him in horror. "Where have you been, Peter?" she asked. "You know, grandmother," he replied. "You know and I know where I have been." With these words, he rose from the table. The grandmother just sat there with her mouth open, staring at him. Peter staggered down the corridor and as he neared the front door, he collapsed and fell to the floor. The grandmother ran over and gathered the boy in her arms, but he wasn't moving. His skin was gray and he looked like death. The old woman was frightened and placed her grandson on the sofa. Then, she called the doctor. While she waited for help to arrive, she dashed from corner to corner, grabbing the boy by the hand, checking his pulse, but Peter showed no signs of life. Finally, the doctor arrived. He bent over the boy to take a closer look at him, then suddenly straightened up. "Old woman," he exclaimed in horror. "This boy has been dead for weeks. Look, he's already begun to rot. His mouth full of maggots." The grandmother burst into tears and said that only half an hour ago, she had fed her grandson sausage, salad, and a bowl of soup. The doctor made a call. The young boy's corpse was taken away, and his grandmother was taken to the police station. After an investigation, they decided that she had killed her grandson over a month ago, hitting him over the head with something heavy. The court found her insane and the old woman was sent to a psychiatric hospital to live out the remainder of her life. The Evil Grin is a scary ghost story about a young girl who goes to visit her friend. When I was 12 years old, I had a best friend named Brenda. After school we always went to her house to hang out. One day, Brenda didn't show up for school. She was absent for the next few days and I began wondering if there was something was wrong with her. After she had missed a whole week of school, I decided to pay her a visit. I cycled all the way across town and arrived at her house just as it was getting dark outside. When I rang the doorbell, I got a shock when the door opened almost immediately. Brenda's mother was standing in the doorway, but there was something strange about her. Her eyes seemed darker than usual and her hair was hanging loose around her shoulders. I noticed that she was wearing a bathrobe. The most unsettling thing was the way she was grinning at me. She didn't say a word. She just stood there staring at me with an evil smile playing across her lips. "Is Brenda here?" I asked, nervously. She beckoned at me to come in, and before I could say anything, she had slipped back into the darkened house. As I stepped inside, my eyes strained to see in the darkness, but I wasn't sure where she had gone. Just then, I heard a strange humming sound and followed it into the kitchen. I found her there, standing at the kitchen sink with her back towards me. The moment I entered the kitchen, she stopped humming and there was an eerie silence. I took a seat at the kitchen table and waited. She seemed to be taking forever. I spent the next 5 minutes just sitting there, wondering what was going on. Then I realized something very odd. The whole time I had been sitting there, she hadn't moved a muscle. Her back was still towards me and I couldn't see her face. Her hands hung limp by her sides and her head was tilted slightly. Something was very wrong. I stood up nervously and approached her. She remained completely still. Ever so slowly, I moved around her and tried to get a look at her face to see if she was all right. The sight still haunts me to this very day. Her eyes were wide open and she still had that evil grin on her face. I was so freaked out that I couldn't bear to stay in the kitchen a moment longer. Without saying a word, I backed out of the room and made my way towards the front door. I jumped on my bike and began cycling as fast as I could down the long, winding driveway and all the way across town. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my house. It wasn't until a few days later that I found out why my friend Brenda had been absent from school. My parents told me that there had been a tragic death in Brenda's family. "What?" I asked. "Who died?" My parents broke the sad news to me, and it made my hair stand on end and I was crying from fright. Brenda's mother had died suddenly, and the night I called over to her house, Brenda had been at her grandparents' place, attending the funeral. Years later, when I was 16 years old, I made a little extra money by working as a babysitter on weekends. One evening, a friend of mine called me and said she knew a family who desperately needed a babysitter. She was busy and wanted to know if I was interested in babysitting for them instead. She told me the parents were very nice, the pay was good, and their 3-year-old daughter was polite and well-behaved. I wasn't doing anything important, so I told her I would be glad to take the job. That evening, I went to the family's house and met the mother. Her name was Ruth, and she was getting ready to go out for the night with friends. She mentioned that her husband was out of town on business and gave me some numbers to call if I needed to get in touch with her. The night went very easily. I made dinner for the little girl, gave her a bubble bath, then got her dressed for bed. I was around midnight when I heard the front door open and footsteps coming down the hallway. I thought it was strange, because I hadn't even heard a car pull up. Turning around, I was relieved to see Ruth making her way into the living room where I was sitting watching TV. She never said a word to me, and, as she walked past me, I was surprised by how different she looked. Something about her eyes had changed, and she was grinning from ear to ear. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew that evil grin. I had seen it before, many years ago. Ruth sat at the dining table with her back turned towards me. Her hands hung limp by her sides. Her head was cocked to the left. She was humming to herself. "Ruth?" I asked, nervously. "Ruth, are you all right?" No answer. "Ruth? You're not alive anymore, are you?" Silence. With shaking hands, I quickly gathered my things and backed out of the room. When I got to the hallway, I opened the front door and looked outside. There was no car in the driveway. All of a sudden, the eerie silence was broken by the sound of the phone ringing. I didn't want to answer it. I was afraid of what I might hear. For a moment, my hand seemed to hover over the phone. Then I lifted the receiver and put it to my ear. I already knew who it was. It was the police, calling to tell me that Ruth had been involved in a car accident an hour ago. She had been killed on impact. Tears were streaming down my face as I ran upstairs, grabbed Ruth's daughter from her bed and bundled her up in her blanket. As came back downstairs, I had to pass by the door to the living room. I could still see Ruth sitting at the table with her back to me. Without pausing for a second, I ran out into the night, carrying the little girl in my arms.